There is a moment that happens in almost every household with a daughter in it, and it happens so fast, so quietly, that nobody in the room ever clocks it as important. A grown-up mentions money. A number gets said out loud. And a little girl in the corner of the room learns, in that exact second, whether money is something she's allowed to understand or something she's supposed to stay out of. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to replay a memory from your own childhood you haven't thought about in years, and it's going to make a lot more sense than it did back then. Here's what almost nobody tells you. That moment doesn't just teach a lesson about money. It teaches a lesson about who a woman is allowed to become. And most women are walking around today still obeying a rule they never agreed to, set by a conversation they don't even remember happening. Let's get one thing out of the way immediately because it trips people up every single time. This has nothing to do with math. Women are not statistically worse with numbers. That theory got buried by research a long time ago, and it still somehow refuses to stay in the ground. So, if it's not math, what is it? Hold that thought, because the answer is stranger than you'd expect, and it's going to take a minute to fully land. Picture a girl in that same house, asking how much something costs. Not out of nosiness, just curiosity, the same curiosity that gets praised in every other subject she's learning about. And the answer she gets back, more often than not, is something like, "Don't worry about that, that's not for you to worry about right now." Not cruel, not even intentional, just automatic. Repeated a few hundred times over 18 years, that one small redirect stops being a passing comment and becomes something much bigger than a childhood memory. It becomes a belief system. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because that belief system doesn't stay in childhood. It follows. It shows up in a boardroom 20 years later when a raise should be requested and isn't. It shows up in a relationship when someone else quietly takes over every financial decision and nobody ever officially agreed to that arrangement. It just sort of happened. It shows up in a woman's own bank app, staring at a red notification badge she has not opened in 3 days. And we're going to get into exactly why that happens, but first, there's something even more uncomfortable we need to talk about, because the fear itself isn't even the strangest part of the story. The strangest part is that the fear was never random. It was useful to somebody. Hang on to that for a second. We'll come back to it. Let's talk about what this actually looks like once it's fully grown, because it rarely looks like fear on the surface. It looks like modesty. It looks like being easygoing. It looks like a woman saying, "Oh, I'm just not a numbers person," with a laugh, like it's a personality trait instead of a symptom. That sentence gets said so often it's basically become a script women hand each other without realizing it. But underneath that casual little laugh is something a lot heavier, and once you notice it once, you cannot stop noticing it everywhere. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If a woman can explain interest rates, mortgage terms, and household budgets with zero problem, why does the exact same brain go quiet the moment she's asked to speak up about her own salary in a room full of people? That's not a knowledge gap. That's something else entirely, and we're getting to it, but not yet, because there's a bigger piece of this puzzle sitting right underneath it. If you want to know why this pattern keeps repeating generation after generation, stick around, because subscribing means you won't miss the part where this whole thing gets flipped completely upside down. Alright, here's the part that changes everything, so pay close attention. For most of history, financial control wasn't just about money. It was about access. If someone cannot access money, they cannot easily leave a situation. They cannot fully choose. They cannot push back too hard, because pushing back has a cost attached that they simply cannot afford. So teaching a woman to stay a little unsure, a little hesitant, a little dependent around finances wasn't some accident of bad parenting. It kept a very specific order intact for a very long time. And systems like that don't just switch off because a law changed on paper somewhere. Culture moves painfully slower than legislation does. That's the twist nobody sees coming. The fear was never really about protecting her from money. It was about protecting the arrangement money was quietly holding in place. Now here's where most people would expect this to turn into a lecture about statistics, but we're not doing that, because the real story is in what this fear actually costs a woman day to day, and it is a lot bigger than a missed opportunity here or there. Researchers who study something called money scripts, basically the inherited beliefs someone absorbs so early they mistake them for their own original thoughts, found a very specific pattern. Women were far more likely to develop what's labeled money avoidance, A belief that money is stressful, complicated, dangerous territory best left to somebody else, somebody more qualified, somebody who just gets it. And avoidance is sneaky because in the moment, it feels like relief. Not opening the account feels calming for about 4 seconds. Not asking about the interest rate feels easier in the moment it happens. But every one of those small avoidances stacks on top of the last one, quietly compounding in the background, working against her in total silence while she isn't looking. And it gets worse before it gets better because avoidance eventually starts costing actual dollars, not just peace of mind. Negotiation research keeps finding the same uncomfortable result over and over across different industries, different countries, different decades. When a woman asks for more money, the exact same request that would pass without a second thought coming from someone else quietly gets read as difficult, or too much, or not quite a team player. So, a lot of women learn, not from a lecture, but from real consequences that actually happened to them or someone they watched closely, that staying quiet is simply the safer move. And once a lesson like that gets learned the hard way, it rarely needs repeating. The body remembers even when the mind has moved on. Let's go back to the household for a second, because that's really where all of this gets built, brick by brick, long before anyone's old enough to notice it happening. Watch how differently financial responsibility gets assigned inside a home. A daughter learns to track the grocery list, learns to stretch a budget for a week, learns to make sure everyone eats without going over. That's financial labor. Real financial labor. But somehow it never gets called that. It gets called helping around the house. Meanwhile, the actual decisions, the big ones, the ones with real consequences attached, quietly stay somewhere else. She's trusted with the execution and excluded from the decision. And that gap right there between doing the work and being allowed to decide is one of the sneakiest training grounds there is, because it doesn't feel like exclusion in the moment. It feels like being helpful. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. That same pattern doesn't stay in the kitchen. It walks straight into adulthood with her. She becomes the one managing the household bills, tracking every due date, keeping every subscription in check, and somehow still isn't the one making the final call on where the money actually goes. Sound familiar to anyone? That's not a coincidence. That's a rehearsed role, one she's been quietly practicing since she was old enough to hold a grocery list, and nobody ever stopped to ask if she wanted the part. There's a name for this, and once you hear it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Call it the good girl tax. Nobody sends an invoice for it. There's no line item on a bill. But it's there in every raise that was never requested, every rate that stayed lower than it should have, every opportunity quietly passed on because reaching for it might have looked like too much. It doesn't get paid once. It gets paid on repeat, year after year, subtracted from a lifetime of earnings that never quite caught up to what the work was genuinely worth. But even that isn't the deepest layer. There's one more thing hiding underneath all of this, and it's the part almost nobody talks about, so listen closely because this is where the whole picture finally clicks into place. Guilt and shame are not the same thing, even though they get used like they're interchangeable. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. A lot of what gets labeled financial anxiety in women isn't guilt about one bad decision. It's shame about existing as someone who supposedly should have figured all of this out by now, as though there was ever a manual handed out, and she simply misplaced hers. Guilt can be corrected with one better decision. Shame just sits there, heavy, whispering that her relationship with money says something permanent about who she is, instead of simply reflecting habits she was never given real permission to learn out loud. Here's something else worth sitting with, because it explains why this cycle keeps repeating instead of breaking on its own. Silence gets inherited just as easily as habits do. A household where money is never discussed openly doesn't produce children who are neutral about money. It produces children who learn that silence itself is the correct response. So, a woman who grew up in a house where nobody talked numbers out loud doesn't necessarily grow up hating money. She grows up not knowing that talking about it was ever an option. And that's a very different problem, one that can't be solved with a budgeting app because the issue was never information, it was permission to even have the conversation in the first place. Keep that in mind, because it's about to matter a lot. And here's the moment this entire thing flips on its head, so don't look away yet. The fear was never actually about the money. Money is paper. It's a number on a screen. It has no personality, no memory, no opinion of you whatsoever. What was actually being avoided the entire time was a version of a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission. A woman who understands money stops needing someone else to explain her own life back to her. She stops outsourcing decisions that were always hers to make. She stops shrinking to stay comfortable in rooms that were never built with her voice in mind in the first place. And that, more than any account balance, is what all of this was really protecting against the entire time. So here's the distinction that actually starts untangling all of it, and it's simpler than it sounds. Self-worth and net worth are two completely different conversations that got fused together somewhere back in childhood and never fully came apart. When money only ever gets discussed in a house through tones of stress or secrecy or embarrassment, a child's brain doesn't file that away as neutral information about resources. It files it away as a statement about identity. Money quietly becomes proof. Proof of being responsible or careless, proof of being put together or falling apart, proof of being enough or not quite enough yet. And once a number becomes a referendum on someone's character instead of a tool sitting in her hand, of course looking directly at it feels terrifying. Nobody enjoys staring straight at something that might confirm their worst fear about themselves. That's exactly why so many women describe opening a banking app the same way they describe stepping on a scale after a rough week, a small breath held, a brace for impact, bracing to be disappointed before a single number has even finished loading on the screen. That reaction was never about financial literacy. It's pure emotional bracing, built by years of treating money like a mirror instead of a mechanism. And separating those two things, self-worth and net worth, has to happen on purpose, because it will not happen by accident. Net worth moves. It responds to decisions, to time, to effort, to circumstance. Self-worth isn't supposed to move just because a paycheck came in smaller this month or an unexpected bill showed up. They were never meant to be the same conversation. An entire generation of women just happened to grow up inside a culture that quietly merged the two, whether on purpose or by accident, until pulling them back apart became one of the harder parts of actually building financial confidence as an adult. So here's where this leaves us, and it's not the tidy little bow most videos try to wrap things up with. The fear a lot of women carry around money was never a personal failure. It's inherited software still quietly running in the background, long after the original reason for installing it stopped applying to her life at all. And software like that doesn't get deleted by information alone. Plenty of women already know how compound interest works. What's actually missing was never knowledge. It's permission, the kind nobody can hand over except herself. So the next time that familiar flinch shows up, the small laugh before admitting the account hasn't been checked in a while, the guilt over spending on herself, the automatic instinct to let someone else take the lead on anything financial, it's worth pausing for 1 second and asking where that reaction actually came from in the first place. Because chances are, it didn't start with her. It started long before her, in a room she doesn't even remember being in, over a conversation she was never officially part of, and it was never really about whether she was capable. It was about who was allowed to feel capable in the first place. Money was never really the subject here. Confidence was. Voice was. The right to take up space in a conversation without shrinking first was. And fear that gets taught quietly can only be undone the same way, deliberately, one honest number, one honest question, one honest sentence at a time, until it isn't a fear anymore. Just a decision. The same as anyone else in the room gets to make. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel isn't really about spreadsheets. It's about the quiet psychology running underneath every financial decision women make. So subscribe if you want the next one to land directly in front of you.